Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to Project One's tutorial video on assessing psychological science. For reference, this is for advanced social psychology spring semester of the 2024-2025 academic year. So I'll just briefly go over the structure for today's tutorial. We're going to start by talking a little bit about the project overview, followed by important links, some factors to check, and we'll also walk through a good example and a less ideal example from last iteration. So regarding the Project One overview, the main aims really for you to achieve is to identify the best scientific evidence, uncover and correct myths or even disinformation regarding these topics, reflect on how this resource might affect what we do in our lives, and really we know what is the best evidence on the selected topic and whether this resource represents this topic well. So the most important thing probably to before you begin Project One is really to check the syllabus. There's a lot of guidance and information there. Some frequently asked questions, for example, or how to critically analyze findings in the literature. Due to the interest of time, we're not going to go over everything about this project in this tutorial. We'll only highlight factors to help you decide whether the evidence is credible and focus on some of those examples that I just mentioned. So there are two submission stages. The first is due March 16th at 11:59 p.m. And all you need to do is to work up to and including assessment of the resource name here and topic resource name here. So you would just replace both of these with your team's topic and resource. This is worth 30% of your Project One grade. Here are just some guiding questions on the assessment that you will make of their work. And then on to stage two. Again, there's more information on the syllabus, but this is due April 27th at 11:59 p.m. This is worth 70% of your Project One grade. So just something to look ahead once you've made past that stage one. So there are a few important links. I just mentioned that syllabus there, right? And then there's also projects from the 2024 iteration. You can take a look. We also have included some books on evaluating information, as well as some suggested readings. So these are all clickable hyperlinks. You can just press on them in case you would like to refer to any one of them. Please take a look at the important links before you ask any questions. Of course, the teaching team or staff are happy to help, but in most cases, you might already find what you need in the syllabus. So there are a few things to think about or factors to check when you are evaluating these resources. There are a few traditional indicators, some general factors or those pertaining to validity, but there are also open science specific indicators as well. So what this means is just that in the realm of open science, which is something that our course really believes in and adheres to, there are practices and reporting requirements that are done in order to indicate essentially how much they adhere to these open science methods. So these are some things that you can be thinking about as you're evaluating your resources as well. We have linked here in this blue star factors to consider when assessing whether the evidence is credible or not. So I highly recommend you checking that out. I think Christy goes into pretty good detail about what factors might be more important than others in terms of evaluating the credibility of a resource. You also want to be thinking about fallacies as well. So sometimes resources might make very broad claims based on just a few single lines of evidence. So those are some things that you want to keep in mind as well. So we're going to now go through the two examples. The first is the good example, and I'm just going to include this over here. It's a good example, and we'll go through why that is the case, but it's not perfect either. There are a few mistakes made when evaluating credible evidence. However, overall, as you will see, this team did a really great job with evaluating the resource. So this team does well by first including each of the claims that was made during this video. So we see here first, there's a claim that prosocial spending brings more happiness than spending on oneself. This team makes the claims very explicitly clear, and then also reviews studies supporting the claim. So you'll see that, for example, they're able to pull out that specific study and also include information about that study. So here we have a cross-sectional national survey, a longitudinal study, as well as an experimental study. And this team also talks about why each of these would make that claim more credible. You want to be cautious in general just to use the word prove. It's a very definitive word. Some things that you could say instead are support or show evidence for. So as you see here, right, each of these are individual claims. And then the team also does well by evaluating the individual claims. Another great thing that this team did was they included a registered replication report. And in the previous slide, we talked about how these are different kinds of indicators in terms of a source's like validity. So these are some things that you want to be thinking about as well. Core claim is great in terms of being able to show which claim you are going to be spending the majority of your time or content discussing on. You want to include a justification for why you may have chosen that as your core claim. And then, as you'll see, the team also does a really great job of signposting. This team also does well in terms of providing an objective review of the evidence in a couple of different perspectives. So you'll see here currency, relevancy. These are really great in terms of helping provide very clear signposts for the teaching staff and really anyone who's going to read your document on each of these subclaims. So in the interest of time, I will probably stop here and then we can talk a little bit about the less good example and why that might be. So we're going to go into Vienna. This group might not have had as an ideal of a performance as the other because essentially they just didn't have enough information to support why the evidence is credible. For example, they include some critique of the sample that this study used, but then there's not a lot of like, for example, they say that it's from a reputable source, but we don't necessarily know how that's decided. And when they talk about assessing trustworthiness, it's really not as comprehensive as we saw the other team did. So, for example, they would say, large sample size, so it's unlikely to be skewed by individual variances, but it's really not as comprehensive as we would like to see. So here we see just sort of relatively short sections on the reliability and validity of this resource, but there are also other aspects to be considered as well. Try to avoid making conclusions based on just one study. So going back to the previous example, we saw that the team was able to integrate evidence from multiple studies to make their conclusion. But for here, it was really just one study. So you want to be cautious of that. And for any kind of broad claims that you make, again, you want to make sure that it's based on empirical studies and not just theory. Essentially, we want you to critically think about when you're evaluating evidence, what are additional things that you can be thinking about, right? So as I mentioned, open science, pre-registration, registered reports, meta-analyses with publication bias, close replications by other labs. We really want you to have a critical mindset in terms of evaluating and reflecting on the biases when we come to understand and read the evidence in the field. So moving on, since we've spoken about those two examples, we can talk about sort of some housekeeping things. So please make sure that you proofread your work before submission to ensure consistent quality and content. So a lot of teams actually struggled with this last semester. Sometimes they would say one thing and then they would contradict their point. Certain sections were well written, whereas others had poor grammar and sentence structure. This actually affects the flow of your work and the reader's understanding, right, of your work. And this actually affects your mark. We understand, of course, like different people might be responsible for different sections of the project, but you want to make sure that the final piece that you submit has consistent quality and content throughout, just to make sure that the mark that you get is reflective of the hard work that you've put in. So for any questions that you might have, please feel free to post on Zulip or find us after class. Here are the references for today's tutorial. So as an additional tidbit, I wanted to go over the collaborative coding sheet that actually my course helped out on in terms of assessing study credibility. So here is a pretty extensive list of factors to think about when you're evaluating the credibility of a particular source. It's separated by different sections. So here you have, for example, on the article level, what are the number of citations, whether the journal is predatory or not, and it goes into like theory, study level metrics, abstract and title, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very long and extensive document, but there are a few things to really think about here. For example, when we are thinking about the theory of a particular paper, we want to make sure that it's falsifiable, which means it can be tested. As you know, in psychology and many other forms of social sciences or sciences, if a theory is not falsifiable, then your findings can't really be evaluated with regard to that theory. So then that kind of throws your entire paper out of scope. So you want to make sure that the theory that they're postulating is testable, right? And it's plausible. And usually we can understand this in terms of, for example, the hypotheses they state. In the study level metrics, we can think about it in terms of like ethics and whether the study, for example, contributes to the field, although this can be quite difficult to evaluate. Methods-wise, just a few examples to think about. For example, if the study does sort of like a between group comparison, you want to make sure that the groups are randomly assigned and whether the assessments are replicable and have they also been replicated themselves. You know, obviously when you go through a particular resource, we're really not looking for you to fill in, right, each of these columns, but these are just generally things that you can be thinking about in addition to Chrissy's very helpful tutorial on factors to consider when you're evaluating the credibility of a particular resource. So I will stop here in the interest of time. But again, if there are any questions, feel free to post on Zulip or find us in class. That is the end of today's tutorial. Thank you all for listening in.